2.5 miles beneath the Aegean Sea, Dr. Kendrick Reid believed he was solving humanity's greatest archaeological puzzle. The ancient bronze gears of the Antikythera Mechanism were supposed to track celestial movements from 2,000 years ago. But when his perfect digital reconstruction pointed to coordinates in deep space, everything changed. The signal wasn't coming from Earth. It was coming to Earth, and something 21,000 light years away had been waiting for his call. The abyss is a place of absolute silence and crushing pressure, a world without sun. Down here, 2.5 miles beneath the churning surface of the Aegean Sea, the only light was the cold, sterile blue spilling from the monitors inside the submersible Triton. It was a tiny bubble of life and science in a realm that had known neither for millennia. Dr. Kendrick Reid's face was a mask of calm, professional focus, his features sharpened by the glow of the main display. His voice was steady, betraying none of the tension that made the very air in the cramped sphere feel thick. Easy, Mark. Left manipulator, 2 degrees. Let the silt settle. On the screen, a remote vehicle, a metal crab scuttling across the ocean floor, obeyed his command. Its powerful robotic arms, capable of twisting steel, moved with the delicacy of a surgeon's fingers, brushing away centuries of accumulated sediment. Beside Reid, Dr. Alara Vance was anything but calm. She was perched on the edge of her seat, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Her breath hitched with every puff of displaced silt. She wasn't looking at the pressure gauges or the sonar readouts. She was staring at the image on the screen as if it were a sacred text, her eyes wide with a historian's fervent hope. "There," she whispered, her voice a ghost in the hum of the sub's life support. "Under that rock formation. You see it?" Reid saw it, a dark, lumpy mass, barely distinguishable from the surrounding rock and debris. To his eyes, it was a data point, a target. To Vance, it was the end of a lifelong quest. The ROV's arms continued their careful excavation, revealing a shape that was just slightly too structured to be natural. A corroded, calcified lump of what looked like bronze and petrified wood. It was a wreck, a ghost of an object that had once known sunlight and human hands. The ROV's manipulators, guided by the pilot's expert hands and Reid's precise instructions, closed around the artifact. The grip was firm but gentle, cradling the object like a priceless broken egg. "That it," Vance breathed, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "That has to be it." Reid's eyes flickered to the mass spectrometer readings, the pressure sensors on the manipulator arms, the stability of the ROV's platform. The data was good, the object was secure. He gave a single curt nod. "Object secured," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the reverent silence. "Let us bring it home." Days later, the artifact sat in a large, salt-water-filled containment tank in the center of the research vessel Helios' main laboratory. The lab was the antithesis of the deep, bright, white, and sterile, a temple to the scientific method. The ship's crew, from engineers to deckhands, gathered around, their curiosity piqued by the whispers of a monumental discovery. Dr. Kendrick Reid stood before them, now fully in his element. He was no longer just a technician in a submersible. He was a master engineer, a high priest of logic, and this was his sermon. He gestured to a large monitor displaying a dazzlingly complex 3D scan of the artifact. "What you are looking at," he began, his voice ringing with authority, "is officially designated Fragment 82 from the Antikythera shipwreck. Unofficially, it is the most sophisticated piece of technology to have survived from the ancient world. Nothing else even comes close." He clicked a remote, and the 3D model on screen rotated, glowing lines highlighting internal structures. It is, in essence, a clockwork computer. The gears you see here, he pointed to a dense lattice of interlocking circles, are cut with a precision that European clockmakers wouldn't achieve for another 1400 years. They track the metonic cycle, the Calippic cycle, the Saros cycle. It predicts eclipses, tracks the positions of the 5 planets visible to the naked eye. It even accounts for the subtle wobble of the Moon's orbit. It is, without exaggeration, the greatest testament to lost human genius. The crew murmured in awe, their eyes fixed on the screen. Vance, standing near the front, shifted her weight. "Kendrick," she said, her voice soft but clear. The historical context suggests it might have been more than just a calculator. Some of the few surviving texts from that period speak of these kinds of devices having ceremonial purposes. Reid turned to her, offering a patient, slightly condescending smile. Ceremonial, certainly. A priest would have used its predictions to set the dates for religious festivals. That's a practical application of its astronomical function. "I meant something more," Vance pressed gently. "Oracular, perhaps. A way to divine the will of the gods from the movement of the heavens." Reid's smile tightened. He turned back to the crew, his tone firm but polite, closing the door on her line of inquiry. "It is a machine, Ilara. A beautiful, complex machine built by brilliant human minds who understood the physics of the cosmos better than anyone else alive at the time. Its purpose was to explain the heavens, not to channel them. Let us not romanticize it." He clicked the remote again, moving on to the topic of bronze corrosion rates in the deep sea environments. The moment of mystery was over. The lecture on facts had begun. For the next several weeks, the main lab became Reid's monastery. The ship hummed around him, but he was an island of pure focus. Days blurred into nights. His world shrank to the few square feet around the artifact and his workstations. We see a montage of his obsession, close-ups of his steady hands, clad in surgical gloves, using tools of his own design to flake away millennia of calcification from a single bronze gear tooth. We see high-speed footage of the Lab's 3D printers, their heads dancing back and forth, extruding glowing plastic as they create perfect, one-to-one scale replicas of each gear he painstakingly scanned and mapped. We see him at a massive whiteboard, which is soon covered in a frantic scrawl of differential equations and complex gear ratio calculations. He argues with himself, erasing a formula with one hand while scribbling a new one with the other. We see him asleep at his desk, his head resting on a pile of ancient Greek astronomical texts, the glow of a monitor illuminating his exhausted face. He is a man possessed by a puzzle, a ghost hunter chasing the spectre of a long-dead engineer. Slowly, meticulously, piece by digital piece, he reconstructs the machine on his computer. He doesn't just copy it, he comes to understand it, to think like its creator. He feels the ghost's triumphs, his frustrations. He is confident. He is brilliant. He is in total control. The night of the breakthrough was quiet. The ship was asleep. The only sounds in the lab, the soft hum of the servers, and the gentle slosh of water in the containment tank. Reid sat alone, a triumphant smile gracing his lips. On his main monitor, the digital reconstruction was 99% complete. Just one final piece remained. With a soft click of his mouse, he selected the last virtual gear and dragged it into its rightful place deep within the machine's core. He hit enter. On the screen, the Antikythera Mechanism came to life. Hundreds of virtual gears, rendered in gleaming bronze, began to turn in perfect, intricate harmony. Dials spun, pointers moved across zodiacal rings, plates slid past each other in a silent, mathematical ballet. It was perfect. It was beautiful. It was the resurrected mind of a genius. Reid leaned back in his chair, a profound sense of satisfaction washing over him. He had done it. He had solved the greatest puzzle of the ancient world. But then his eyes caught a flicker of movement. On the far side of the model, a small, unassuming dial one he had theorized was for minor calendar corrections began to spin. It moved past the vernal equinox, past the winter solstice, past any known marker. It continued to spin until it clicked into a position that had no corresponding celestial event. no known significance. It was an impossible position. Then, a line of text flashed on his screen, rendered in a stark, intrusive red. Error. Celestial object unknown. Reid's smile vanished. He leaned forward, his heart suddenly beating a little faster. His brow furrowed in confusion. He stared at the error message, then at the impossible position of the dial. It had to be a glitch. A rounding error in his own code. It had to be. There was no other rational explanation. An error is a question you haven't answered yet. This was one of Dr. Kendrick Reid's favorite maxims. For 48 sleepless hours, that single red-lettered question had burned itself onto his retinas. Celestial, object unknown. The initial confidence that it was a simple coding bug had long since evaporated, replaced by a gnawing, frustrating obsession. The main lab was a chaotic map of his thought process. Monitors displayed overlapping star charts, a constellation of data points from different ages of humanity. He had cross-referenced everything. The Almagest of Ptolemy, the Babylonian Emule Apin tablets, the modern, exhaustive Gaia Sky survey from the European Space Agency. He had run simulations accounting for 22 centuries of stellar drift and precession. The answer was always the same. The coordinates indicated by the anomalous dial on his virtual mechanism pointed to a patch of absolute, featureless black in the Ophiuchus constellation, a void. He was running a final diagnostic, his face gaunt in the monitor glow, when Alara Vance entered the lab with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She placed one on the only clear corner of his desk. "Any luck, Kendrick?" she asked softly. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, his eyes raw with fatigue. "Luck has nothing to do with it. It's a data problem, and the data is flawed." Vance looked at the screen, at the spinning star charts, and the stubbornly empty target box. "Maybe it's not an error," she suggested, her tone gentle, tentative. "Maybe it is pointing to something we just haven't found yet. A brown dwarf, or a rogue planet." Reid let out a short, sharp scoff, a sound heavy with intellectual exhaustion. "Alara, this is a 2,000-year-old piece of clockwork, not the Hubble telescope. Its gears were ground by hand. The simplest explanation, according to the principle of Occam's razor, is not that it is a revolutionary tool of discovery, but that it contains a flaw. A beautiful, intricate, but ultimately human flaw in its original design." He said the words, but they tasted like ash in his mouth. A flaw that Precise felt, somehow, less likely than the alternative. The bridge of the Helios was a world away from the controlled chaos of his lab. Here, everything was calm, orderly, and pragmatic. It was the domain of Captain Eva Rostova, a woman whose worldview was forged in the unforgiving realities of naval command and maritime logistics. She stood with her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of professional patience and profound skepticism. "Let me be clear, Doctor," Rostova said, her voice as steady as the ship itself. "You want me to point our deep space communications array, a multi-million-dollar instrument with a 3-year waiting list for research institutions at a patch of empty space?" "Not empty," Reid countered, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "Just optically barren. We haven't to listen to it. Not with this level of sensitivity." Rostova's eyebrow arched. "And your justification is a suspected flaw in a 2,000-year-old artifact, which UV only simulated on a computer." This was the heart of the problem. To get what he wanted, he had to argue against the very conclusion he had just presented to Vance. "My model is an exact replica, Captain. Every gear, every tooth, every ratio is perfect. If that dial is pointing there, it's because the original Greek engineer designed it to. That wasn't a flaw, it was a choice, a deliberate, calculated, scientific choice. And I have to know why." The words came out with more force, more passion than he intended. It was no longer about proving a flaw. It was about solving an equation. His unyielding scientific curiosity, the very engine of his being, had overwhelmed his skepticism. Rostova studied his face for a long moment, seeing past the tired eyes to the core of relentless inquiry that made him one of the best in his field. She sighed, a sound of resigned pragmatism. 24 hours, Doctor, she said. You get the array for 24 hours. After that, we go back to the mission plan. Don T, make me regret this. Night fell. The Helios continued its silent glide through the Mediterranean, its powerful antenna now pivoted, like a great ear, toward a silent speck in the cosmic dark. But 24 hours felt like an eternity. Reid found himself in the lab, staring at the real artifact in its tank. The digital model was a perfect copy. Yes, but a copy is just a shadow. The truth, if there was one, was in the original. He couldn't let it go. On impulse, he made a decision that violated a dozen protocols. He powered up a diagnostic rig, attaching hair-thin microprobes to a low-voltage, high-stability power source. He couldn't risk sending a current through the entire corroded structure. He'd destroy it. But maybe, just maybe, he could bypass the damaged outer layers and energize the core directly. His hands were steady as he guided the probes into the containment tank, navigating the delicate, calcified lattice of bronze. He found what he was looking for, a small, central gear cluster that his scans showed was almost perfectly preserved. He attached the probes. He took a deep breath and activated the power source, sending a tiny, controlled trickle of electricity into the heart of the machine. For a moment, nothing happened. He felt a familiar sting of disappointment. Of course, it was just a lump of dead metal, and then a light. It wasn't an electric spark or a chemical reaction. It was a faint, warm, golden glow emanating from deep within the interlocking gears. It was soft, organic, impossible. Reid stared, his scientific mind scrambling for an explanation. Phosphorescence, a bizarre form of bioluminescence that had lain dormant for centuries. None of it made sense. The light strengthened slightly, and then it began to pulse, a slow, steady rhythm like a resting heartbeat. He was utterly, completely mesmerized. On the bridge, the graveyard shift was underway. The comms officer, a young man named Diaz, stared with bleary eyes at the waterfall of data from the array. It was all noise, cosmic background radiation, the faint whispers of distant known pulsars. 23 hours and 50 minutes of absolutely nothing. He was already composing his log entry, ready to shut the search down, when a new pattern scrolled onto his screen. It wasn't loud. It was a faint, rhythmic whisper, hiding beneath the static. But it was there. And it wasn't random. It was a structured, complex signal, a repeating sequence of nested pulses. It was undeniably artificial. Diaz's eyes widened. He shot upright in his chair, his fatigue vanishing in a surge of adrenaline. "Captain, to the bridge!" he yelled, his voice cracking. "Captain, now!" At that exact moment, in the quiet of the lab, Reid was still transfixed by the pulsing golden heart of the mechanism. The sight was so impossible, so rule-breaking, that his mind had simply stopped trying to analyze it and had given into awe. His phone buzzed violently on the workbench, startling him. He snatched it up. It was Vance, her voice breathless and urgent from the bridge. "Kendrick, you're not going to believe this. We've got something, a signal, from your coordinates." As her words hit his ear, the comms feed from the bridge automatically patched through to his own monitor. A data stream appeared, a visual representation of the signal Diaz had just found. It was a sine wave, a pattern of peaks and valleys, a pulse. Reid's blood ran cold. He looked from the phone to the pulsing wave on his monitor, and then to the artifact in the tank. The soft, golden light inside the ancient machine was pulsing in perfect, undeniable, one-to-one synchronicity with the signal being received from the depths of space, 21,000 light-years away. The superstitious myth that Vance had proposed, the idea of a communicator, was being validated in real time by the hard, empirical data of a radio telescope. Reid's carefully constructed world, built on the bedrock of logic and knowable facts, was not just cracking, it was being pulverized by an impossible, terrifying truth. The thin membrane between the known and the unknowable had been torn open, and for a long time, nobody spoke. The three most senior people on the research vessel, Helios, sat around a metal table in the ship's deserted mess hall. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and profound shock. The faint, rhythmic pulse of the signal, now being piped through a small speaker on the table, was the only sound. A heartbeat from the void. Dr. Kendrick Reid was the first to break the silence. His face was pale, his scientific composure shattered, but his mind was already working, desperately trying to build a new box to contain the impossible. "It could be a pulsar," he said, his voice raspy. "A binary system with a unique magnetic field, creating a feedback loop with the metallic resonance of the artifact. A 1 in a trillion cosmic coincidence." Captain Rostova looked at him, her expression unreadable. "A coincidence that started the exact second you powered it on?" she asked, her tone flat. Reid had no answer. Rostova's gaze shifted, her mind already on the next, more practical problem. "My question is this: who do I report this to? Do I call the Hellenic Navy and tell them we've found an ancient Greek radio? Do I call SETI and tell them to listen for a ghost? We are in an impossible position, protocol-wise." Dr. Alara Vance had been silent, her eyes distant, her fingers scrolling through files on a tablet. She looked up, her expression one of dawning, fearful understanding. "The mariners' myths from this region," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "The pre-Hellenic ones, they were unique. They don't talk about angry gods on mountains or titans in the sea. They talk about whispers from the depths, a song that would guide lost ships home, but only if they were carrying the right talisman. They describe it as a voice that sang the song of the void." She slid the tablet across the table. On the screen were fragmented translations of ancient pre-Homeric texts. Reid stared at the words. Rostova read them over his shoulder. "What if we've been asking the wrong question?" Vance continued. "What if this wasn't a calculator to predict the heavens? What if it's a transceiver designed to talk to them?" The word talk hung in the air, displacing all of Reid's desperate rational explanations. The scientific method hypothesized, test, conclude, was now being applied to an idea that, just yesterday, he would have dismissed as absurd folklore. The following day, the lab was transformed. The tension of the emergency meeting had been replaced by a new, focused, collaborative energy. Reid no longer saw Vance as a romantic historian. He saw her as a vital source of data he had arrogantly ignored. They worked in a strange, brilliant tandem, a synthesis of two worlds. Reid stood at the main whiteboard, which was now covered not in gear ratios, but in complex wave propagation models and signal analysis. He was treating the transmission with rigorous physics, trying to decode its structure, its language. "The nesting of the pulses," he muttered, more to himself than to Vance. "It's not a simple beacon. It's layered, like it contains subpackets of information. It's incredibly efficient." Meanwhile, Vance was at her own workstation, a universe of digital archives at her fingertips. She was no longer just looking at history. She was searching for the ghost of this impossible technology. She ran complex search algorithms, cross-referencing the unique, almost organic shapes of the mechanism S-gears with symbols from obscure alchemical, Gnostic, and astrological texts. She reasoned that if a scientific culture had created this, a pre-scientific one might have tried to describe it using the language of magic. "Kendrick," she said suddenly, her voice tight with discovery. Reid turned from the whiteboard. She pointed to her screen, displaying a scanned, fragmented piece of parchment from the Library of Alexandria, a text that had supposedly been destroyed. "It's a partial translation of a text on bronze oracles. Most of it is nonsense, but look at this line." She highlighted a phrase. Reid leaned in to read it. "And the oracle does not speak of our stars, but maps the heavens of the creators, so they may find their way home." Reid stared at the words, a cold dread mixing with his scientific curiosity. "The heavens of the creators," he whispered. He looked from the ancient text on Vance's screen to the glowing artifact in its tank. The two disparate worlds, her history and his physics, were rapidly converging on a single, terrifying point. Night fell again, but sleep was an irrelevant concept. Driven by the new discovery, Reid knew he had to push the experiment further. The signal they were receiving was faint, layered. He reasoned that it was a low-power handshake signal. The mechanism itself was a passive listener. What if it could do more? What if it needed more power? "I'm going to increase the voltage," he announced to Vance. "Slowly. If this thing is a transceiver, maybe we can boost its reception." He returned to the control rig, his hands steady. He carefully nudged the power dial upwards. Inside the tank, the golden glow at the artifact's core brightened, spreading through the intricate network of gears like blood through capillaries. More and more internal sections began to light up, illuminating parts of the machine that had been dark for 2 millennia. The gears, which had been still, began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, whirring with a faint, almost inaudible hum. Then, the soft golden light began to coalesce in the space above the device. It shimmered like heat haze, and then flickered into a stable, 3-dimensional image. It was a hologram, a star chart, projected into the air with stunning, impossible clarity. Reid and Vance stared, speechless, their breath catching in their throats. It was the most beautiful, miraculous thing either had ever seen. But as their eyes adjusted, a profound wrongness settled over the scene. The constellations were all wrong. The familiar shapes of Orion and the Big Dipper were gone, replaced by alien geometries of stars. At the center of the projection, where their own sun should be, was a binary star system, 2 suns, one gold, one white, locked in a graceful dance. And orbiting them were 3 planets, all glowing with the soft blue-green light of life. The evidence was empirical, it was visual, and it proved, without a shadow of a doubt, that the mind that conceived of this machine was not from this solar system. They watched the alien sky, mesmerized by the silent, rotating projection. Vance finally broke the silence, her voice a whisper of awe. "It's a map, an atlas." As she spoke, the map began to shift. The 2 suns and 3 planets dissolved, the alien constellations fading like smoke. They were replaced by a new projection, a complex, rotating schematic of interlocking parts, intricate circuits, and strange, flowing energy conduits. It was a blueprint. "What is it building?" Vance asked, her sense of wonder now tinged with confusion. Reid didn't answer. His face had drained of all color. The look of awe had been replaced by one of dawning, absolute horror. His body trembled. "It's not building anything," he finally managed to say, his voice a choked whisper. "It is something. The signal we detected that wasn't a broadcast meant for anyone to find. It was a response." He looked from Vance's confused face to the terrifyingly complex blueprint hanging in the air. His voice dropped, thick with terror. "We just sent a ping across the galaxy, Alara. We rang a doorbell 21,000 light-years away." He raised a shaking hand and pointed at the schematic. "And this isn't a map. It is a lock-on." The moment the words left his lips, a piercing klaxon blared to life, shattering the silence of the lab and echoing throughout the entire ship. A frantic, terrified voice erupted from the lab's intercom speakers. It was Diaz, from the bridge. "Captain, the signal S changed. The amplitude is off the charts. It is a high-energy directional beam, and its point of origin is our location." On Reid's monitor, the tactical display automatically updated. A solid red line shot out from the Ophiuchus constellation, a scarlet spear thrown across the galaxy. It crossed the void in an instant and ended at a single blinking point in the middle of the Aegean Sea. It ended, precisely, on them. The klaxon was a physical assault, a screaming red slash through the fabric of reality. On the bridge of the Helios, organized chaos reigned. Alarms flashed on every console, and crew members shouted technical jargon that was utterly inadequate for the situation. Captain Rostova was a pillar of calm in the hurricane, her voice sharp and clear as she barked orders. Shut down all non-essential power. I want every bit of juice we have rerouted to the deflectors. Get me a full spectral analysis of that beam now. Dr. Kendrick Reid stumbled onto the bridge, his face ashen, his balance unsteady. He ignored the frantic activity, his eyes locked on the main screen, where a terrifying energy graph was climbing off the charts. The red line from Ophiuchus was no longer just a targeting vector. It was a fire hose of raw, cosmic power pointed directly at them. Rostova saw him. "Doctor! What in God's name did you do?" Reid didn't seem to hear her. He stared at the energy dispersal readings, his analytical mind kicking into gear even as his body trembled with primal fear. The pattern was wrong. The energy wasn't concentrating at a single point for maximum impact. It was diffuse, strangely coherent. Everyone was bracing for an impact, for the silent final flash of a weapon that could cross a galaxy. "It's not a weapon," Reid said, his voice quiet but cutting through the noise. Everyone on the bridge turned to stare at him. Rostova looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Reid, that thing has more energy than a supernova." "What are you talking about?" "The dispersal," Reid explained, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. "It is a wide-spectrum broadcast. The energy profile is all wrong for a destructive beam. It is a carrier wave." He looked at the captain, his eyes wide with a new, more profound terror. "It is not trying to destroy us. It is data. It is downloading. The lab was the epicenter. To call it a light would be an insult to the word. It was a sun. The Antikythera Mechanism, the small lump of corroded bronze, was now glowing with a blinding, terrifying brilliance that bleached all color from the room and cast sharp, dancing shadows. It was a contained star, roaring silently in its tank. Above it, the holographic projector was no longer displaying a map or a blueprint, but a raging, three-dimensional storm of information. Trillions of alien symbols, galactic maps, and incomprehensible equations flashed and swirled too fast for the human eye to process. A hurricane of pure data. The ship systems couldn't handle the bleed-through. Sparks erupted from fried computer consoles. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and melting plastic. Reid, Vance, and a handful of crew members could only watch from the sealed doorway, their faces shielded by thick, polarized blast visors. They were completely, utterly powerless. This wasn't an experiment to be observed or a phenomenon to be measured. This was a cosmic event of unimaginable scale, happening 2 feet away from them, and all the science of humanity was reduced to a single primitive function: to witness. They were spectators at the birth of a new Bible written in a language of lightning. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The blinding light vanished. The holographic storm collapsed into nothingness. The ship's main power failed, and the emergency lights flickered on, casting the corridor in a dim, unsettling red glow. The transfer was over. The lab was sealed, deemed too hazardous to enter. The ship was adrift, running on fumes. An hour later, Vance found Reid in his cabin. The small room was a wreck. Books had been torn from their shelves, their pages ripped out. A tablet computer was a spiderweb of shattered glass against a bulkhead. This had not been an act of scientific frustration. It was an outburst of pure, nihilistic despair. Reid was sitting on the floor amidst the wreckage, his back against the wall. He wasn't angry anymore. He was hollow, broken. He stared at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. This was his ordeal, the complete and total death of the man he used to be. Vance slid down the wall to sit beside him, not speaking, simply offering her presence in the quiet ruin of his certainty. "My sin," Reid whispered, his voice hoarse, wasn't pride. It was certainty, the absolute, arrogant certainty that the universe was a locked room and that science was the only key. We just had to be smart enough, patient enough, and we could map every corner, explain every shadow. He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I thought we were the ones asking the questions." He finally looked up at Vance, his eyes filled with a terrifying, profound emptiness. All this time, Ilara, we were just the answer. A low, persistent chime echoed through the red-lit corridor. An automated alert. A system had come back online. Vance looked at her tablet. "It's the lab," she said. "The environmental sensors are back to normal, and the artifact is drawing a tiny amount of power from the emergency grid." They rushed back to the lab, overriding the seal. The oppressive heat and the smell of ozone were gone. The room was dark, silent. The artifact in its tank was inert, a lump of bronze once more, except for one thing. On its surface, a single, small point of light was pulsing. It wasn't the brilliant, terrifying gold from before. It was a calm, steady blue light. As they cautiously approached the tank, the holographic projector above it flickered to life one last time. It wasn't a storm of data or a map of the stars. It was a stable, crystal-clear image, a live feed. The viewpoint was from a first-person perspective, looking down at instruments that were sleek, metallic, and utterly non-human. The viewpoint moved, gliding silently down a long corridor made of the same shifting liquid-like metal they had seen in the blueprints. There was no sound, just a serene, unnerving sense of purpose. The viewpoint turned and approached a vast, transparent wall, a window. It looked out into the blackness of deep space, at the distant swirl of an unfamiliar nebula. Then it turned again, its gaze tilting downwards. Through the window, they saw it, a shimmering blue-green planet, marbled with clouds of white. It was beautiful. It was unmistakable. It was Earth. The feed didn't waver. It just kept looking down at their world, growing larger, closer. It's coming. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in soft shades of grey and rose, but on the deck of the Helios, a different light was dawning, a creeping, impossible shadow that fell over the ship, eclipsing the rising sun. It was a cold, absolute darkness that had no source in the clouds above. Crew members, drawn by an instinct older than reason, scrambled onto the deck. They pointed, their faces masks of pure terror, their shouts stolen by the wind. With an eerie, profound silence that was more terrifying than any roar, a craft surfaced from the ocean. It was not a submarine. It had no welds, no rivets, no discernible edges. Its surface was a roiling, shifting liquid metal that mirrored the fearful faces staring up at it. It was impossibly large, a floating mountain of alien geometry that displaced the water without a sound. It did not threaten. It did not communicate. It simply hung there on the still surface of the sea, waiting. The long debate between science and superstition was over, rendered meaningless. The impossible was here. While the crew was paralyzed with fear on the deck, a new kind of understanding was taking shape in the lab. The frantic terror had drained from Dr. Kendrick Reid, replaced by a strange and unnerving calm. He was lucid, his eyes clear, as he watched the single blue light on the mechanism's surface. It was no longer just pulsing. It was blinking in a frantic, complex and urgent pattern. Ilara Vance stood beside him, trembling. "What is it doing?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It is a handshake protocol," Reid said, his voice even. He finally understood every piece of the puzzle. It is establishing a secure connection, preparing for a final data transfer. He looked at Vance, his expression one of profound clarity. "It wants to go home." He pointed to the inert fried equipment around the lab. "That is why the beam didn't destroy us. The data it downloaded, it wasn't an attack. It was a power source. It was the key. We couldn't power this thing, not really. So it brought its own." He gestured to the blinking artifact. "The blueprint it showed us wasn't TT for building a weapon. It was for turning this device into a gate." His transformation was complete. He was no longer just a scientist operating on data. He was fusing those principles with an intuitive leap of faith, interpreting the intent of an entity beyond human comprehension. With a serene sense of purpose that defied the terrifying reality outside, Reid reached into the tank and lifted the Antikythera Mechanism. It was warm to the touch, and the blue light pulsed brightly in his hands. He turned and walked out of the lab. "Kendrick! No!" Vance cried, rushing after him. He emerged onto the deck into the cold morning air, into the shadow of the alien craft. Captain Rostova saw him, her face grim. "Reid, get back inside!" That S an order, but Reid didn't stop. He walked calmly to the edge of the deck, his steps steady, his gaze fixed on the silent, liquid metal vessel. He held the glowing mechanism aloft, an offering to a new god. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, a beam of soft, pure white light emerged from the alien craft. It was not a weapon, not a data stream. It was gentle, like moonlight. It enveloped the ancient artifact. The mechanism levitated from Reid's grasp, its internal gears, both real and spectral, spinning at an impossible speed, letting out a single, high-pitched harmonic chime. The air in front of Reid began to shimmer, to warp. Reality itself tore open, not with a violent rip, but with a graceful unfolding, opening a stable, shimmering portal between the ship and the craft. The Antikythera Mechanism, the bronze oracle, floated slowly through the gate. Before the portal closed, Reid was granted a glimpse of the other side. It was not the sterile interior of a ship or a chamber of horrors filled with monsters. It was a breathtaking, impossible landscape, a sky of deep indigo, dominated by the brilliant glare of two suns. And below that alien sky stood a world of crystalline cities that gleamed and refracted the light, cities of impossible grace and beauty. It had never been an invasion. It was a recovery mission, a long, patient search for a probe, a message in a bottle, lost to the depths of a primitive world millennia ago. The portal snapped shut, leaving no trace of its existence. The vast craft, its task complete, sank silently beneath the waves. The impossible shadow lifted from the ship, and the morning sun reclaimed the sky. Silence fell, broken only by the gentle sound of the sea. Later, the lab was a tomb of dead technology. The investigation was swift and baffling. Every digital log from the event had been wiped clean, erased by the energy field. Every reading, every signal, every hologram was gone. All that remained was the fractured, unbelievable testimony of the crew and a broken, inert piece of bronze, now just a lump of metal once more. Reid stood over the empty pedestal where the mechanism had sat. He had returned with a truth that could change the world, but he had no proof, no data, no falsifiable evidence to present to a peer-reviewed journal. Nothing to take back to the world of science that had once been his church. He had only his experience, his testimony. The final shot is an extreme close-up on his face, mirroring the image of a man torn between two worlds. The horror was still there, a faint echo in his eyes, the memory of humanity's infinitesimal place in the cosmos. But it was now overlaid with a profound, transformative, and strangely peaceful understanding. The staunch scientist had died, and in his place stood something new, a believer, a prophet, a man who had seen the heavens of the creators and had come home with nothing but a story. What is so compelling about this story isn't the alien ship or the portal. It's the journey of Dr. Reid. He starts as the voice we're all taught to trust, the brilliant, rational scientist who can explain the world, stripping away romance and superstition to reveal the elegant clockwork underneath. He looks at this ancient, mysterious object and sees only a machine, a testament to human genius. But the story's brilliance is that it doesn't just throw ghosts at him to challenge his worldview, it uses his own methods against him. Every step of his scientific process, the diagnostics, the signal detection, the power readings, confirms a truth that his science says is impossible. The very data he worships leads him into the heart of a mystery he cannot measure or contain. He is logically, methodically, and empirically forced to confront the sublime. And that's the transformation that sticks with you. In the end, after witnessing a truth beyond human comprehension, all of his precious data is wiped away. The scientist is left with no evidence, no proof, nothing to publish. All he has is his experience, a story. He is forced to become the very thing he would have debunked, a believer whose truth can only be shared through testimony. It leaves me thinking, if you were confronted with an undeniable, world-changing experience, but all the physical evidence vanished, which would you choose to trust? The memory of what you saw with your own eyes, or the silence of a world telling you it couldn't possibly be real?